We're back. Welcome to this week's episode of Insights. During this week's show, we're going to cover two primary topics. The first one is going to be the tragic death of 15 Armenian soldiers in Gagharkunik province in the fire that was occurred at their base last week, and obviously updates on the continued illegal blockade of Artsakh by the Aliyev regime. Let's talk about the first topic of this week, which is the tragic fire at the Gagharkunik army base that caused the death of 15 soldiers. Some of these facts are disputed, some of them are established, but let's just go through them. This 15 soldiers died from a fire incident in a building that they were located in their border post. This was a group of military sappers. The building that they were staying in had no fire escape or firefighting equipment. The reason that the soldiers were actually in these barracks, because this is the group of soldiers whose army base was attacked and destroyed in the September 13th Aliyev's invasion of Armenia. It appears that most of these soldiers actually died while sleeping in their beds. The fire apparently started when someone tried to pour gasoline onto the heater that they were using, which is something that is actually against regulations. So what has been the government response to this? Their first response was to fire 8 military commanders that were somehow related or responsible for this event, including the head of the Second Army, Major General Vahram Grigorian. They also responded by saying that these barracks that these soldiers were staying in were temporary, and that they had an order of new barracks and living spaces that are already actually in the country, imported from Italy, but have obviously not been sent around the country. However, in reality, even what they're describing is not going to solve the problem, because what they're actually providing, these Italian-made modulars, and they're actually Armenian-made modulars also, is that they actually create very good living quarters as far as showers and other things. However, they're death traps in a war zone, because they can be targeted in the first minute of warfare, especially if it starts at night, which is almost every attack starts early in the morning. So this actually is not going to be solving the problem that they're outlining that needs to be solved. While trying to understand better and sort of analyzing these tragic events, I think we really need to look at it in two ways. One of them is in very practical terms as far as the reforms that are needed in the army that are long overdue. And the second one is sort of the philosophical, the kind of thinking and approaches that actually bring you events like this. It is true that military reform has started, including with the building of a military-industrial complex, but in truth, it has started too late and it is too slow, and it's simply not ambitious enough. And on the most basic things, which is things that really don't require money, but what they require is political will, the organization and competence to do it, which is basic safety equipment, fire equipment, building better bunkers. Those are something that are not a question of time. There's a question of will, and that's one of the greatest failings of this current government, because military reform, yes, it's a long-term process, but some of the most basic things, like safety equipment and better bunkers, can be done in a matter of months. What the army needs, this is something we have known, is fundamental reform, and that fundamental reform frankly starts by firing the incompetent class of generals that we have in the military. If you actually understand what people who have been following events or are involved in reform processes in the Armenian military, you essentially have multiple classes. You have a leadership right now in the defense minister and the chief of staff that are actually interested in reform. And then you have lower echelons from NCOs to colonels and lower that are actually interested in modern change and reform. And then you have this deadweight class of generals that essentially are doing everything that they can to thwart reforms and not to allow us to have the new military culture that we need, and all of these people need to go. Secondly, we need to destroy this mind-numbing bureaucracy of the army, where everyone is worried about looking over their shoulders over minor things rather than focus on building the country's defenses up to the standards that we need. We need to create systems that actually reward initiative and risk-taking and don't punish you for it. And finally, and most importantly, we need to move towards a Western style of military education, which is something that is already slowly happening and actually has been going on for years, and to get away from the Russian one. And now, why is that? Because part of the problem with the Russian military education is because it is inherently corrupt. There's many people who go up there for their advanced education who get their advanced accreditations not by working for them or studying them, but essentially buying them. And that is simply not a way you build a modern army. Now we need to look at this, the history of military reform under this current government and all the problems that go with it. We need to understand where some of these issues come from as far as the slowness of reform. One of the things that happened post-revolution, it is very clear that this current government was very wary of or afraid of really touching the army or trying to reform it in any way. One, because the army had a reputation as the one institution in the country that works, which we found out actually is not the case. And because so many people in our military actually politically connected with people in Moscow. So it was always a place where they tread very lightly. In the post-war period, there was obviously a greater problem by the fact that the army leadership, entered political life by demanding the resignation of the prime minister, which was foolish. It is not their job to talk about who should be leading the country. And lastly, obviously on this front, has been the Russia factor, because as we know, there were military orders on with large amounts of money that were already paid for, that were never delivered. This is before the Ukraine war started. And obviously, I think some of the Russian-oriented generals have actually done their best to make sure that the military doesn't reform itself in a Western direction. However, this is the time that there's no more excuses, and this tragic event is the opportunity to clean house and get rid of all this dead wood in the military that is preventing us from creating a modern military force. Now I'm going to sit back and look at sort of the fundamental roots of this problem, because there's a philosophical road that gets you to events and tragedies like this. And then what it really comes down to is having a political culture in which lacks the concept of moral responsibility. And there's a distinction between responsibility and blame. You can be not blamed for something, directly blamed for something, but you need to take responsibility. That is what is required of our leaders, and what we're requiring of them is a higher moral imagination, that you actually take responsibility for things that you are not personally directly responsible for. And what have we had here? We've had no apologies from the Prime Minister. We've had no apologies from the Defense Minister. We have no apologies from the Army Chief of Staff. And that is not only unacceptable, it's disgraceful. We all deserve better than that. Now we're going to move on to the second and most important topic of the week, which is the continued illegal blockade of Artsakh by the Aliyev regime. In truth, the situation is getting worse by the day. There's severe shortages of medical supplies and food. Gas is being cut and turned on and off over time. We have electricity shortages, long periods of blackouts, expanded school shutdowns, and unfortunately, we really don't see any end in sight. Now let's go around the world and see the reactions from different countries and power centers. The Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov made multiple statements that there's negotiations going on and he's hopeful about reopening of the road. I don't know where he gets his optimism from or what he's trying to tell us with that, but nothing has been done. There's supposedly mid-level negotiations going on, but nothing conclusive that's going to open the road anytime soon. Then we move on to the EU Parliament, which actually passed a very strong resolution in detail that clearly blamed who's responsible for what is going on in Artsakh, blamed the Azeri regime and accused them of trying to achieve ethnic cleansing. But they're the EU is divided into two. It's the Parliament, then you have the Council and the leadership, and from them we got very disappointing language from Toivo Klar, and if you actually listen to him, you would know who's blockading whom for what reason. So that was quite disappointing and weak, but frankly not surprising. When you go to the United States, there's been very strong language, both from the Secretary of State, who directly spoke with the dictator in Baku and made it clear that the United States was asking for the opening of the road. However, all of this is all good, but frankly, it means very little, minus much more distinct political pressure. And in the case of the Aliyev regime, the only thing they understand, which is threats, the threats of actions that can be taken against them in order for them to lift the illegal blockade of Artsakh. Now let's study what all of this has meant from a political and public relations perspective. First and foremost, this blockade of Artsakh has been a political disaster for the Aliyev regime, from a PR perspective specifically, and they lost a narrative about it long ago. No one takes their reasons for closing the road seriously. Everyone clearly understands who the aggressor is and who the victim is in this case. The next thing that it's done is it has entirely collapsed the Russian political position in Armenia. for a very simple reason, because if you look at this, there's only two variables here. And the first one is what I call the weak Russia option, which is Russia has been weakened to such an extent that its army and soldiers can be humiliated by some thugs from a third-rate state. Or something that is the more likely option, in which this is a Baku-Moscow operation to bring Armenia to its knees, which, if true, makes them even look worse. Now, when you look at this, given what their intentions were as far as pulling away Armenia from the West, or Armenia's move towards the West, has actually had the exact opposite result. It's actually cementing Armenia's move to the West. The other thing that it has done is it has made the issue of Karabakh and the rights and the well-beings of Armenians living there the central issue in the region. This is after the fact that the Aliyev regime has spent 2 years trying to marginalize them and get them out of any conversations in any program that's going to achieve long-term peace. And most importantly, is actually opened up the window for us to be able to internationalize this issue and not let it be a plaything between the regime in Baku and the Russian government. And lastly, what Aliyev has actually accomplished is actually to destroy this very useful fiction that was very useful to him, the United States and the EU, that there are scenarios in which the Artsakh Armenians can actually live while being ruled by the regime in Baku. Now, given the fact that Aliyev in front of the world and the world's media is trying to starve to death 120,000 Armenians he claims to be his citizens, that is a claim that is very hard to make or take seriously. He has, in so many words, and in no uncertain terms, made it clear that his plan is ethnic cleansing, and he's essentially telling the world, that's my plan, what are you going to do about it? And anybody who doesn't understand that is delusional. In conclusion, what I want to close by is actually a look into Armenian foreign policy over the last 40-something days. Frankly, it's been quite active, and it's actually been using the right language as far as talking about ethnic cleansing across the board. I think they were very smart not to fall into that trap of negotiating. Because there was negotiations that were in late December in Moscow, because that was a trap. It was a trap to start negotiating about opening the road when there's nothing to negotiate. There's already clear treaty requirements that the Aliyev regime has to keep the door open, and we should not give them anything for something that they have already committed to. What is lacking, however, is greater public diplomacy, which would be much more aggressive in making our case and saying to the world that this is the best proof that we have no partner in peace. And we need to say that aggressively. We need to move towards talking about sanctions from behind the scenes to talking about it publicly, especially when it comes to Magnitsky sanctions, which are actually easier to pass because they target corrupt individuals rather than an entire energy system or an economy in Baku. And lastly, frankly, we need to stop playing nice with the Russians. We need to put them on the spot. They're the ones who killed the UN resolution in making sure that there's a UN role in this conflict. Well, then if that's the case, ask them for an airlift. You have the airport, you have the capacity, no one's going to shoot you down. Go ahead and airlift aid and all the things that are necessary into Artsakh until the road is open. I would also open the roads for all foreign media to get to where the Russian peacekeepers are at and let them be turned away by the Russian peacekeepers. It is not our job to make them look nice. In reality, the degenerate running Baku has given us all the diplomatic and PR tools to hang him with. Let's make his wish come true.
You'll never untangle the circumstances that brought you to this moment. You're a warrior. Arise now, mighty warrior. With the full understanding that they've already been killed, and so have you. This is just a play. This is my will. You're caught up in the circumstances that I determined for you, that you did not determine for yourself. So arise, you're a noble warrior. Embrace your destiny, your fate, and stand up and do your duty.